I told my father the move made sense before I told him it was happening. That was the mistake, if you want to call it that, though at the time I didn't think of it as a mistake. I thought of it as efficiency. I stood in the doorway of the corner office he'd occupied for 38 years, the one with the window that caught the loading dock and the highway both, and I said, "We're going to need this space for the integration team. I've got you set up down the hall. I had a floor plan on my tablet. I had already measured the smaller office for a desk." He looked at the room for a second. Not long, just a second, and then he looked at me and said, "It's fine. It was too big for me anyway." That was it. No argument, no request for a week to think about it, no call to my sister. He picked up the photograph of my mother off the credenza and the brass paperweight shaped like a semi-truck that one of his old drivers had made him in a machine shop 30 years ago, and he walked it all down the hall himself before I could even offer to help. I didn't understand what that sentence cost him. I want to be precise about that, because precision is the only thing I have to offer you here. I did not understand, in that moment, that a man like my father does not say a thing is fine unless he has already decided what he is going to do about the fact that it isn't. It would be 18 months before I found out what he'd decided, and by then, the smaller room was the least important thing to have happened in it. My name is David Kessler. I'm 42, I live outside Chicago, and until 14 months ago, I was president of Kessler Freight Solutions, a logistics and trucking brokerage my father built from a single leased truck in 1979 into a company that by the time I took the president's title was clearing $60 million a year in managed freight. My father is Walter Kessler. He is 74. He founded the company, ran it for 39 years, and 5 years ago handed me the president's chair and told everyone, including me, that he was stepping back. I want to walk through exactly how this happened, in the order it happened, because I've spent a year and a half rearranging the order in my head to make myself look better, and I'm done doing that. I'm going to tell it straight, the way my father would tell it if he told stories about himself, which he doesn't. He isn't a man who narrates his own life for an audience. If he were sitting across from you instead of me, he'd give you the dates, the dollar figures, and maybe one sentence of feeling at the very end, and he'd consider that generous. I'm not built quite that spare, but I've tried to get as close to it as I can, because anything more decorated than that would be dishonest to who he actually is. My father built Kessler Freight the way a lot of men built things in the 70s and 80s, on his own signature, his own credit, his own word given across a diner table to men who had no reason to trust him except that he showed up on time and never once in 40 years failed to pay a driver what he was owed. He used to say that a contract was just a written record of a handshake that had already happened, and if the handshake wasn't good, the contract wasn't going to save you. He said it so often that it became a kind of company motto, unofficial, the thing new hires heard in their first week from somebody who'd heard it from somebody who'd heard it from him. He ran the business the same way for 4 decades, relationships first, paper second, and a memory for names and kids' birthdays and old grudges that put your average CRM system to shame. The detail that matters, the one I'm asking you to hold on to, because it comes back, is that my father never fully trusted any system he hadn't built with his own hands. Every big account, every difficult client, every arrangement that mattered, he kept a paper trail on, personally, in a locked file cabinet, in a form nobody else ever saw in full. People who worked for him for 20 years used to joke that Walter Kessler ran 2 businesses, the one on the org chart and the one in that cabinet. I used to find it charming, in the way you find your father's habits charming when you don't yet understand their load-bearing. He built the company on a specific kind of stubbornness that doesn't get talked about much anymore because it doesn't scale the way investors like things to scale. In 1979, he leased 1 truck, drove it himself most weeks, and underbid every larger carrier in the Chicago corridor by a margin that should have put him out of business inside a year. It didn't, because he never missed a delivery window, and he never once shorted a driver on a paycheck, even the 2 years the company nearly went under during the early 80s recession, when he told my mother, more than once, that he'd rather sell the house than tell a man his pay was late. That's not a story he tells. I got it from my mother, and from 2 of his earliest drivers, both retired now, who still send him a Christmas card every year addressed to the old man with genuine affection in the words, not irony. By the time I came up through the company, I started in dispatch at 23, worked freight brokerage for a decade, ran operations for another 5 years before he made me president, I believed. Honestly, that I understood the business as well as he did. Better, in some ways. I understood the software, the margin analytics, the parts of the industry that had modernized past what he was built for. I could read a rate confirmation faster than he could, and I could build a spreadsheet model of our exposure to fuel price swings that would have taken him a week to do by hand, if he'd have done it by hand at all, instead of just knowing the answer from experience. He knew people. I knew systems. I told myself that was simply the generational handoff working the way it was supposed to. The son modernizing what the father built, each of us doing the part we were suited for. What I didn't examine closely enough, in those years, was how much of the company's actual durability, the accounts that never left no matter what a competitor offered, the drivers who stayed 15 and 20 years past when a better wage was available 3 towns over, ran entirely on the part of the business I considered secondary. I had convinced myself the systems were the engine and the relationships were the paint job. It would take me a long time and a very specific phone call to understand I had that backward. 18 months before the room, we'd started closing a merger, an acquisition, technically, of a mid-size Midwest carrier called Praxis Transit, which would nearly double our fleet capacity and put us in a different weight class entirely. It was the deal of my career. It was also, if I'm honest, the deal I needed to prove that the company was mine now, not his. That whatever came next for Kessler Freight would be remembered as something I built, not something I inherited and managed carefully. I don't think that's a shameful thing to want. I think it's an ordinary thing to want, dressed up, at the time, as pure business logic. The integration team needed office space. The corner office was the biggest room on the floor. My father wasn't running client meetings out of it anymore, hadn't in years, by his own choice. It made sense. That's the justification. I'm not going to dress it up further than that, because it wasn't more complicated than that. Timing, space, and a son who wanted the building to look, finally, like it belonged to him. I'd been telling myself a version of that justification for months before it ever became an actual conversation with my father. Every time the integration lead, a sharp, impatient woman named Renata Cole, who'd come over from Praxis's leadership team, raised the question of office space in a planning meeting, I'd feel a small, specific relief at having an obvious answer available. The corner office, underused, sitting there like a problem solving itself. I never once, in any of those planning meetings, said the words my father's office out loud. I said the corner suite, or the founder's office, phrases with the person scrubbed out of them, which I understand now was its own kind of tell. You don't need to depersonalize a decision you're comfortable making about a person you're comfortable making it about. The day of the move, I'd scheduled it for a Tuesday morning before the office filled up because some part of me, some part I didn't examine closely enough at the time, didn't want an audience. My sister Elaine happened to be in the building that morning, dropping off papers for the accountant, and she caught the tail end of it, my father carrying a banker's box down the hallway himself. Past the conference room, where 6 people from the Praxis integration team were already unpacking laptops into what had been his office for 38 years. Elaine pulled me aside near the coffee station. "You couldn't have waited until after the deal closed?" she said. "You couldn't have given him the dignity of at least asking?" "I did ask," I said, which was technically true and completely beside the point. He said it was fine. He would say a car was on fire, and it was fine, David. That doesn't mean it's fine. I remember being irritated with her, not because I thought she was wrong, exactly, but because I didn't want to spend the energy considering that she might be right. I told her the integration needed the space, that Dad understood the business realities better than anyone, that this was exactly the kind of pragmatic call somebody had to make, and I was the one positioned to make it. She looked at me for a long moment, longer than my father had looked at that empty office, and said, "Just don't be surprised if this costs more than a room," and went back to her car. I filed that away as Elaine being Elaine, sensitive to things that didn't require sensitivity. I had a deal to close. Renata Cole, for her part, thanked me for handling the space allocation efficiently and moved on to the next line item on her integration checklist without a second thought, which at the time felt like validation, and which I now understand was simply a woman from outside the family correctly reading the room as a real estate problem, because that was the only version of it anyone had shown her. She'd never met my father before that week. She had no way of knowing what she was watching. I did, and I chose not to know it either. My father's new office was 110 square feet, previously used for file storage, with a window that looked at the side of the building next door instead of the loading dock. He set it up in about 40 minutes. He kept the photograph of my mother. He kept the paperweight. He brought over the locked file cabinet. I remember two of the guys from the warehouse helping him wheel it down the hall on a dolly, and I remember thinking, in passing, that it was strange he cared enough to move that particular piece of furniture himself, rather than let it go into general storage with the rest of the old office equipment, and then not thinking about it again for a year and a half. I stopped by that first afternoon, once the integration team had finished unpacking down the hall, to see how he'd settled in, a small gesture I told myself counted for something. He had the desk positioned, so his back was to the window rather than facing it, which struck me as odd until I realized, years later, that it was the same orientation he'd kept in the corner office, facing the door, always able to see who was coming. Old habits don't need square footage to survive. He asked me how the integration team liked their new space, not how I felt about having taken his, and I told him they seemed pleased, and he nodded like that settled the matter. And I left thinking the conversation had gone about as well as it could have. I didn't yet understand that a man who spends decades reading rooms for a living doesn't need to say much to tell you exactly how a conversation actually went. For the next several months, the company ran exactly the way I wanted it to. The Praxis integration went smoothly on the surface. Smoother, frankly, than I'd projected, and I gave myself credit for that. My father came in most days, later than he used to, left earlier, took fewer meetings. He said good morning to people in the hallway. He asked about their kids. He did not, as far as I could see, do very much of anything that looked like running a business, and I told myself that was exactly as it should be. A man who had built something for 40 years, easing gently into the role of company elder, present but no longer load-bearing. I want to be specific about how good that period looked from where I was standing, because the story doesn't mean anything if I undersell it. Managed freight volume was up 11% year over year. The Praxis fleet had folded into our dispatch system with less friction than any acquisition our advisors had modeled. I gave a presentation to our board in the fall, the first one I'd ever given entirely without my father in the room, at his own suggestion, since he said the board should get used to hearing the numbers from me and not from him, and I remember driving home that night feeling, for the first time since I'd taken the president's title, like the company was mine in more than name. I told Carol as much over dinner. She asked, not unkindly, how my father had seemed the last time I'd actually sat down and talked to him about something other than the numbers, and I didn't have a good answer, and we let it go, the way you let go of a question you don't want to spend an evening on. There were 3 things that happened during that stretch that I noticed and dismissed, and I want to be honest that I noticed them, because the version of this story where I claim I had no signals at all would be a lie, and I'm not interested in telling a more comfortable lie than the one I already told myself for 18 months. The first was that my father started having lunch every third Thursday with Ron Alderman, the owner of Bellwood Manufacturing. Bellwood was our oldest client, older than me actually, one of the first accounts my father ever signed, back when Bellwood was one plant in Joliet and Kessler Freight was a single leased truck. By the time of the merger, Bellwood had grown into a client that represented close to 30% of our managed freight revenue, almost entirely because Ron Alderman had never once, in 40 years, considered using anyone but Kessler. When I noticed the recurring lunches on my father's calendar, which I only saw because his assistant still copied mine on scheduling, out of habit, I assumed it was two old friends staying friends. I thought it was sweet. Honestly, I did not think about what it meant that Ron Alderman, whose company's freight contract I was actively restructuring as part of the Praxis integration, was spending 3 hours a month alone with my father. I actually mentioned the lunches once in passing to Renata Cole, framing it as a nice example of legacy relationship maintenance, a phrase I'm not proud of, because I remember being pleased with how professional it sounded. Renata nodded and said something about how it was good PR to keep the old guard visibly engaged during a transition, and we moved on to talking about warehouse consolidation in Gary. Neither of us asked the obvious question, which was why a man who'd supposedly stepped back from day-to-day operations was still meeting, alone, with the single most important client relationship in the company, on a fixed and recurring schedule, without it appearing on any integration plan either of us had built. The second thing was smaller. At a family dinner maybe 8 months into the new arrangement, my father mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd had to sign something for Bellwood's contract renewal, since I'm still listed as a guarantor on that one. From way back, he said. Reaching for the salt, not looking up. I remember asking, mildly, whether that was still active, and him saying, far as I know, and the conversation moving on to my daughter's science fair project. I didn't follow up. I had a closing to prepare for. A guarantor clause on a 40-year-old contract sounded like exactly the kind of legacy paperwork nobody had bothered to clean up. Not a live wire. Carol noticed it. Actually, before I did, not the clause itself, just the way he'd said it, quick and low. The way a man mentions something he doesn't especially want asked about twice. She brought it up in the car on the way home. Did that sound strange to you, the way your dad said that? I told her it sounded like Dad being Dad, precise about details nobody else would bother remembering, a man who still thought like a business owner even after he'd stopped being one day to day. She didn't push it. Neither did I. It's a small thing, in the grand accounting of the 18 months, but it's one of at least 3 moments where somebody who loved me tried to hand me a thread, and I was too satisfied with how the year was going to pull on it. The third thing was the file cabinet. It stayed locked in his 110-square-foot office, and once, looking for a stapler, I opened the drawer beneath it out of habit and found it wasn't the cabinet at all, but a small, separate filing box he kept beside his desk, full of what looked like handwritten account summaries, names, dates, dollar figures, notes in his handwriting, going back years. I closed it. I remember thinking it looked like the kind of thing a man keeps for sentimental reasons once he's not really running the business anymore. An old habit outliving its usefulness. I did not think it looked like a man still actively managing the parts of the business that mattered most. None of these, on their own, would have told me anything. Together, in hindsight, they told me everything. But hindsight is a courtesy nobody extends you in the moment, and at the time my life was proceeding exactly as I'd planned it. Praxis had closed. Revenue projections were up. My wife, Carol, had stopped asking me pointed questions about my father over dinner, which I took as a sign that whatever tension had existed around the room had quietly resolved itself, the way most tensions do if you simply wait them out. It was a Wednesday in late spring, 14 months after the move, when I got the call from our outside counsel, a man named Phil Ostrander, who had handled Kessler Freight's legal work for over 20 years. Phil doesn't call to chat. When he called that afternoon, his voice had a flatness to it I recognized from exactly one other conversation in my life, the day we found out a competitor was trying to poach the Praxis contract out from under us before the ink was dry. I was in the middle of reviewing Q2 numbers when the call came through, and my first assumption, genuinely, was that it was about a rate dispute with one of the smaller Praxis legacy accounts, the kind of thing that came up 2 or 3 times a quarter and usually resolved itself with a phone call and a modest credit. I remember being mildly annoyed at the interruption more than anything else. That's worth saying plainly because it tells you how far from my mind the actual subject of the call was. "David," he said, "I need you to come in. Bring your father. Can you tell me what this is about?" I'd rather do it in person. It's about Bellwood. I called my father's extension. He picked up on the second ring, the way he always does, and when I told him Phil needed us both downtown, he didn't ask why. He said, "I'll drive myself," and hung up, and something in the flatness of his voice, not surprised. Not curious, simply willing, should have told me he already knew what this was. Phil's conference room had the Bellwood file open on the table when we walked in, along with a document I'd never seen, a single typed page, yellowed at the edges, dated 1987, titled Founders Continuity Rider, attached as an amendment to the original Bellwood service contract. Phil slid it across the table to me. "This was drafted when your father and Ron Alderman's father renewed the contract the first time," Phil said. "It states that the preferred rate terms Bellwood receives, the ones that make up roughly 40% of the value of that account to us, are contingent on continued personal involvement from Walter Kessler in the relationship. Not the company. Him, specifically, by name." I read it twice. It was real. It was notarized. It predated me joining the company by 6 years. When Praxis closed, Phil continued, our integration paperwork moved every major account onto standardized company-level contracts, effective the date of closing. Nobody flagged this rider because nobody currently at the firm, including me, until last week, knew it existed. It was never in the digital contract management system. It was in a paper file your father kept personally. "So we're out of compliance," I said, already doing the math on what a Bellwood contract dispute would cost us, already feeling the particular cold drop of a deal I was proud of turning out to have a hole in the floor. 30% of managed freight revenue at 40% preferred value was not a number I could do quietly in my head without my hands going cold. I was already, in that half second, drafting the version of this I'd have to bring to the board. The version where I'd overseen an integration that quietly exposed our largest account to a compliance failure nobody had caught, because nobody had known to look. "You were out of compliance," Phil said. Past tense. Ron Alderman's attorney called me Monday. Not to threaten anything, to confirm that the rider's terms have, in his words, been satisfied to Mr. Alderman's complete satisfaction, on an ongoing basis for the past 14 months. I asked Phil to say that again, because I genuinely didn't parse it the first time. He did, more slowly, and I sat with it for a second before I understood what he was telling me, that the exposure I'd just spent 30 seconds panicking about had already been closed, quietly, over more than a year, by somebody in this building who had never once mentioned it to me. I looked at my father. He was sitting very still, hands folded on the table, the way he sits in every meeting, revealing nothing. "The lunches," I said. "The lunches," Phil confirmed. "Your father has been meeting with Ron Alderman every third Thursday since the move, in a personal capacity, specifically to maintain the continuity the rider requires. He's also been keeping his own account records on Bellwood by hand this whole time. Updated pricing, service issues, everything. Because he didn't trust the new integration software to flag a problem before it became one. Which, as it happens, it wouldn't have. I've been through the new system. There is no field in it for a contractual clause tied to an individual's personal relationship with a client. It doesn't know how to see this kind of thing. Your father does, because he wrote it." Phil pulled a second folder toward himself, thinner than the first. "There's more. When we pulled the account history to verify compliance, we found 3 service exceptions on the Bellwood account over the past year. Weather delays, a warehouse fire at one of their suppliers that backed up a shipment, a driver shortage during the holiday crunch. That never made it into any exception report I've seen. Your operations team has no record of them. Your father handled all 3 personally, off the books, before they ever became visible enough to need handling. One of them, the warehouse fire, could have cost you the account outright if Alderman had been left waiting on an answer for even a day. Your father had a replacement carrier lined up within 4 hours, using a relationship with an owner-operator he'd known since 1994. A man who isn't in your vendor system at all, because he retired from full-time driving a decade ago and only takes work now as a favor. That's not in any system, David. That was never going to be in any system. That's 40 years of a man's own memory, doing a job your software can't do. I sat with that for longer than I'd like to admit, in front of Phil, saying nothing, because there wasn't a version of a response that didn't require me to reckon, out loud, with how much of the last year I'd spent congratulating myself for a stability that had nothing to do with anything I'd built. I asked the question I already knew the answer to, because I needed to hear it said out loud in the room, in front of him. Why didn't you tell me? My father looked at me for a moment before he answered, the same unhurried look he'd given the corner office the day I emptied it. You had a deal to close, he said. I didn't think you needed one more thing on the list, and I didn't need the room to do this from. That was the whole answer. 9 words that mattered, and a handful more around them. He didn't tell me it was hard. He didn't tell me it hurt him to be moved down the hall while men half his age arranged furniture in his old office. He didn't ask for credit for having, in effect, personally saved a third of our revenue base from unraveling, because I hadn't known enough about the business I ran to know what I didn't know. He'd known the merger would create exactly this exposure, a personal continuity clause nobody had accounted for, and instead of using it to embarrass me, or negotiate his way back into the corner office, or simply let the chips fall and watch what happened when I found out the hard way, he had spent 14 months quietly doing the one thing that would keep the company, and me, from taking a hit I hadn't seen coming. I want to sit in that fact for a moment because it took me considerably longer than a moment to actually understand it. My father had every reason and every means to let this become a disaster with my name on it. He had the leverage. He had the relationship. He had, frankly, the grievance. I had moved him out of the office he'd occupied for 38 years to make space for a deal I wanted more than I wanted his comfort. And I had done it without much ceremony and without much thought for how it would land. A different man, a man with less discipline or a longer memory for slights, could have simply let the Bellwood contract collapse under my watch and let me learn, publicly and expensively, exactly how little I'd understood about what I'd inherited. He didn't do that. He spent a Thursday a month, for over a year, protecting a deal that had cost him his office, without telling a single person what he was doing or why. I've turned that arithmetic over more times than I can count since that afternoon in Phil's conference room. It would have cost my father nothing, reputationally, to let it happen. Nobody would have blamed a 74-year-old man eased into semi-retirement for not flagging a compliance gap in a merger he hadn't been consulted on. If anything, the fallout would have landed entirely on me, and on Renata Cole's integration team, and I would have deserved every bit of the board's scrutiny that followed. He had, in other words, a clean and quiet way to be proven right about how he'd been treated, with his hands entirely clean. He chose the harder, less satisfying, completely invisible option instead, doing the actual work of protecting something he'd spent 40 years building for a son who had not, by any fair measure, earned that protection that year. There's a version of this story, and I've heard variations of it from other men in rooms not unlike Phil's, where the father's competence becomes a weapon, where the discovery is really a reckoning delivered with teeth, a father finally showing the son what he should have respected all along and making him feel small in the process. That's not what happened here, and I want to be exact about that distinction, because it matters. My father never once, in that conference room or after it, made me feel the size of what I'd missed. He didn't need to. The size of it was obvious on its own. What he did instead was quietly close the gap I'd left open and let me discover on my own timeline exactly how much I owed him for it. I misjudged him. That's the first thing, and I want to state it as plainly as he would state it if our positions were reversed. I believed my father's usefulness to this company had a shelf life, and that the shelf life had expired the year I made president, and I built 5 years of decisions on top of that belief without ever once testing whether it was true. It wasn't true. It was never true. He wasn't diminished. He was simply quiet, and I had confused those two things because quiet was convenient for me. The second thing is harder to say, because it isn't about my failure of judgment, it's about the size of what he did in spite of it. My father's restraint through all of this, the calm acceptance of the smaller room, the 14 months of unglamorous, uncredited work to hold together the one account that mattered most. The fact that he let me find out from a lawyer instead of using it as leverage over dinner wasn't passivity. I'd spent 18 months mistaking his silence for surrender. It was the opposite of surrender. It was a decision, renewed every third Thursday, to protect his son from the consequences of his son's own carelessness, without ever cashing in the moral debt that decision created. That's not weakness. I don't have a better word for what that is than love, and I recognize that's not a word my father would use about himself, so I'll use it about him instead. We didn't have a scene in that conference room. Phil talked us through the compliance fix, formally amending the rider into the new contract structure. With my father's continued involvement now documented and protected rather than accidental, and my father asked 2 clarifying questions about the paperwork, the way he'd ask about anything else, and that was the extent of it. It wasn't until we were in the parking garage afterward, standing by his car, that I said the thing I actually needed to say. "You could have let it fall apart," I said. "You could have let me find out the hard way, in front of the board. God knows I earned that." He was quiet for a second, keys in hand. "Wouldn't have done either of us any good," he said. Then, after a pause that I now understand was him deciding whether to say the rest of it, "I built that account before you were born. Wasn't going to let it go because you and I had a bad year. That was as close as my father has ever come, in my presence, to naming what happened between us as a wound. A bad year. 9 words for 18 months. The same economy he'd used for everything else. I didn't ask him to say more. I understood, standing there, that asking him to expand on it would be its own kind of taking. One more thing I wanted from him on my timeline, in my language, instead of his. We stood in that parking garage for a while longer without saying much else. He asked about my daughter's science fair project, the one that had come up at the dinner table the night he mentioned the guarantor clause, and I told him she'd placed second, and he said that sounded about right, since the judges that year always favored the volcano kids over anything that required actual understanding of a variable, which was as close to a joke as my father gets. And I laughed harder than the joke deserved because I needed somewhere to put everything else I was feeling, and laughing was the only door he'd left open. Then he got in his car and drove home, and I sat in mine for another 10 minutes before I could make myself do the same. What I did instead, over the following months, was try to make the correction in the currency my father actually deals in, which is action, not sentiment. The first thing I did was move him back into the corner office, not as an apology performed for an audience, but because it was, factually, the room from which client relationships like Bellwood's had always been run, and pretending otherwise had cost the company real money once already. I didn't make an announcement of it. I had his name put back on the door on a Friday afternoon and said nothing more about it than, "This one's yours." Always should have stayed that way. The second thing I did was formalize what he'd been doing quietly for a year. I created an actual advisory role, with a title and a retainer and a seat in strategy meetings, built specifically around the kind of institutional knowledge that doesn't live in a database, the Bellwood account and 4 others like it, contracts and relationships that had been running for decades on personal trust rather than paper. I told the board, honestly, that this wasn't a courtesy title. I told them the company had nearly lost 1/3 of its revenue base because we digitized a business my father built on handshakes and hadn't kept the person who understood the handshakes in the room. Nobody on the board argued with me. A few of them, I think, had wondered for a while why we hadn't done it already. Renata Cole, to her credit, was the first person on the integration side to ask what she should have asked 18 months earlier, whether there were other riders like the Bellwood one buried in older contracts that the digital system had never been built to catch. We spent 6 weeks going through every legacy account my father had personally originated before 1995, and found 2 more, smaller, less costly than Bellwood but real, both of which my father had known about, and neither of which he'd volunteered until we started actually looking. When I asked him why he hadn't just told us all 3 at once, back when Phil first called, he said, "You asked about Bellwood. I answered about Bellwood. It wasn't withholding, not the way I might have withheld something out of spite. It was simply his lifelong habit of answering exactly the question in front of him. No more, no less. The same economy that had made him hard to read for 38 years in that corner office. And the same economy that meant if I wanted the rest of what my father knew about this business, I was going to have to actually ask him, directly, instead of assuming I already had it. I've since made a habit of asking, not as a performance of reconciliation, but because it turned out to be good business, which he would appreciate as a reason more than any other I could offer. My father accepted both of these the way he accepts most things, without ceremony and without letting me off easy, either. When I offered him the office back, he said, "Didn't need the office, but I'll take it, since you're offering." When I told him about the advisory role, he read through the retainer terms twice before he signed, the way he'd read a contract from anyone else, and then he said, "This is fair," which from him is not a small thing to say. He didn't tell me it fixed anything. He didn't tell me he forgave the 18 months in the smaller room, and I didn't ask him to. Because I understood by then that forgiveness delivered on demand isn't worth much, and my father has never in his life given anything that wasn't worth something. I think about pride the way my father would want me to think about it, which is plainly, without much decoration. I spent 5 years running a company built by a man I had quietly decided was past his usefulness, and I built that decision on nothing sturdier than his own refusal to argue with me about it. I mistook his silence for absence. I moved him out of the room he'd earned because I wanted the room to look like it was mine, and it cost me nothing, right up until it nearly cost me everything, and the only reason it didn't is that the man I'd underestimated spent 1.5 years quietly making sure it wouldn't. There's a particular kind of arithmetic men like my father run, one I don't think I fully understood until I watched him run it against me. The cost of being right about how you've been treated is almost never worth more than the cost of the thing you damage by proving it. He could have proven he was right. He had the evidence, the leverage, and every reasonable justification. He decided the company, and the son who ran it, mattered more than being owed an apology in front of witnesses. I don't know that I've ever done anything in my life that required that particular kind of discipline, and I've spent the months since trying to understand it well enough to practice it myself, with mixed results. What it costs to assume someone has less left in them than they do isn't measured only in the near miss with Bellwood, though that would have been expensive enough on its own. It's measured in the 18 months I spent believing a settled question that was never actually settled, in every dinner where I didn't ask him what he was really thinking, every meeting where I spoke for the company as though speaking for myself, every quiet Thursday I never once wondered about. Those months are gone. I can fix the office and the title and the retainer, and I have, but I can't get back the 1.5 years I spent certain of something that wasn't true. I don't know how many fathers would do what mine did for a son who'd earned it less. I know I got one, and I know now what it looks like when a man decides that being underestimated by his own son is a cost he's willing to carry alone, quietly, for as long as it takes. If this one sat with you the way it sat with me, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more measured, honest stories.